Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're going to make a bar top arcade using less than one sheet of plywood. A while back I made a full-size arcade machine. If you haven't seen that video series, you should definitely go check it out. A lot of people really liked that project, but it was also really big and just kind of daunting for some people to take on. So I wanted to do a smaller version for people who may not have that much room for a full-size machine or may not want to dump the money or the time into it. The electronics on this system are identical to the large one, so if you've seen those videos, you know exactly what to do. This is really just about building a smaller enclosure. We're also going to leave off some of the fancy things like custom graphics, but you could always add those later. All right, let's build this thing. I took a SketchUp model and the profile of my arcade machine, took it into Illustrator and traced it, and then printed out that outline at full size. This printed out on multiple sheets of paper, so I just taped them together with some Scotch tape, and used some spray adhesive to attach it to the 1/2-inch plywood. I used a jigsaw to cut this shape out, but I didn't go right on the line, instead just a little bit outside of it, especially on the corners. The template peeled right off, and I used a belt sander to flatten all of the flat surfaces and round over some of the corners. I also used a file and some sanding blocks to get the whole thing smooth and round. This one would act as my template to cut out the other side exactly the same. I clamped it down to the plywood and cut a general shape out so I had a smaller piece to work with, and then I clamped them together and used a flush cut bit on my router to cut out the second one exactly the same shape as the first one. I drilled a small hole in a popsicle stick and then measured in 1 inch. I put my pencil in this hole and then dragged it around the profile of this entire piece of wood to give me an offset that was even from every edge. I drew some lines to square off these corners and then measured from point to point. These sizes are what I needed to cut out of the plywood. I used a guide on my circular saw to cut down this large sheet into smaller pieces to make it easier to work with. I cut the piece for the control board and then cut a few 1-inch strips. These strips got cut into small mounting blocks that got glued and nailed in place. These blocks are here to hold my pieces in place while the glue dries, without having to put in screws from the outside face. These blocks also set at the point where 2 panels will join together, so I know everything is going to line up and sit evenly. For the pieces that have a bevel on one end, I held them up to the drawn line and marked where they overlapped it. Then I turned the blade to match that mark and cut the bevel. For the most part, these worked the first time, but a few of them had to be tweaked to get the right angle. I laid the monitor on this panel and measured in the same distance from every side to make sure that it would sit right in the center. Once I had it right in place, I traced it and then used a circular saw to cut it out. You could cut these out with a jigsaw, but I don't get straight lines with a jigsaw when I use it, so I used a circular saw. I did use a jigsaw to cut out the corners though. In my large arcade, the monitor actually sat behind this bezel, but in this case, I just made it big enough to fit right around the monitor to make it easier and faster. It fit pretty well, so next I had to mount it in there permanently. I took the stand that came with the monitor and pulled out the metal bracket. I screwed this bracket onto a piece of wood and then latched it back into the back of the monitor. I laid a piece of wood across and then measured the offset from the back of my bezel piece and cut some spacers to fit. I laid a piece of plywood across the spacers and screwed it into my new mounting bracket. To hold the spacers, I just added some glue and put them in place and then flipped the entire thing over. I shot in a couple of brads on the front face just to hold these in place while the glue dried. Then I flipped it back over and put the monitor and the bracket back in place. I pre-drilled some holes down into these side panels and then screwed the whole thing together to lock it all in place. To remove the monitor, I just had to take out those 4 screws in the mounting bracket and it could come out. I added some glue, lined up the monitor housing, and then drove in a couple of brads just to hold it in place again while the glue dried. The next piece was just cut to fit. I cut it larger than it needed to be, held it in place, and then cut the bevel on the other side before gluing it and nailing it in. The marquee area was a little bit different. First I cut the bevel on the edge, then I cut it down to size, then I took it to the bandsaw and cut it into strips. Basically I cut the top and the bottom and the 2 side strips, leaving the center section out completely. I glued in the side piece here, trying to get the pieces as tightly together as possible, knowing there would be some small gaps to fill later. I added this top section and then reinforced it with another panel behind it. This is really just the same process over and over, making the panels to fit, making sure they have the right bevel, and then gluing them in place. But of course this was only one side of the arcade, so I flipped it over and laid it on the other panel, lining these pieces up with the line that I'd drawn before. I added some more blocks at all of the corners to hold them in place and give them a point to line up with. Then I moved it away and added a layer of glue in between my line and the blocks. I fit the whole thing back together and connected everything with nails where I needed to, and let all the glue dry. but I didn't attach the control panel, and that's because it needs a whole bunch of holes. I printed out the template for all of the controls and glued it on just like the side panel. Using a Forstner bit on my drill press, I drilled out all of the holes and then peeled away the template. I slid it in place to make sure that it fit, but it still wasn't ready to permanently attach. I cut a panel and glued it into the bottom just to hold the whole thing in shape and have a place to set all the electronics. Before painting, I needed to cut a slot around the outside to use for the T-molding. There's a particular slot cutting bit that I have for this, and I'll have it linked down in the description along with everything else. Basically, you put it in a router and then run it around the entire profile, and it cuts a slot made specifically for T-molding. I also had to do this in the front of the control panel. Then I just painted everything black. Really quickly, if you've never been to ILikeToMakeStuff.com, be sure to go check it out. I've got a lot more information about all of these projects, as well as a list of all the tools and supplies that you will need to make them yourself. I've also got a store where I sell t-shirts and stickers and pencils and digital plans for a lot of the projects that I make. So go check it out, ILikeToMakeStuff.com. After the paint dried, it was time to add the T-molding. You can just press this stuff down into the slot using your thumb. It adds a lot of protection and a really pro look to your cabinet. I'm going to stop right there and actually make a little change. Now the next step would be to mount all of the buttons in here, push everything in from the back side and connect all the wires, and then drop this in place and fix it permanently. The problem with that is that if I need to change anything on the underside of the buttons, like if a wire comes loose or something's wrong, it's going to be really hard to get to. So now what I'm thinking is actually mounting this board in place firmly, but then on the bottom of the machine, cut an access panel. There's really no reason to have a solid bottom down there, so I'm just going to cut out a section around here so that I can reach right up in and fix things if I need to. Since this was painted, wood glue wouldn't do much, so I used CA glue to hold the control panel in place. I used my vinyl cutter to cut out some logos to add to the buttons. Now I covered this entire process in the other videos, but it's pretty simple if you have access to a vinyl cutter. You have to take the buttons apart, but then basically you just put a sticker on them and then put them back together. I also covered the full wiring process in the other videos, so I'm not going to do that again here, but essentially you crimp on some connectors to the end of wires, plug them onto the buttons, and then the other ends go into the control panel. Once you have all the buttons wired and connected, then you have to make some daisy chains to connect all the lights and all the grounds between each one of the buttons. The LEDs in all the buttons are connected to a single power source that just gets plugged in. I went ahead and started mounting the electronics on the inside of this board and then added an LED strip along the top of the marquee. To make the marquee, I'm going a lot simpler than I went last time and cutting a piece of Lexan and using some stickers again from my vinyl cutter. Just a note here, I'm putting these on the back side of this plastic, so these were printed out backwards. To diffuse the LEDs behind this sign, I laid it on a piece of freezer paper and then cut it to size. I used some super glue to hold this on the back of the stickers. This probably wasn't the best way to do it. It didn't turn out great, but it looks alright. Essentially, you just need something there to diffuse the light. Again, I used CA glue to hold it in place and then turn on the lights, and it worked pretty well. I'm connecting this old monitor through an adapter to go into the HDMI. After that, I just put all the electronics in the back and used some hot glue to glue in some computer speakers and a power strip to get everything in place. This is kind of a lo-fi version, and this is a quick and easy way to get everything held in. I dropped the monitor in and screwed in the brackets to hold it in permanently. Now notice, I'm not putting a back panel on my machine, and that's because at Maker Faire, I want people to be able to look in the back of this and see what's inside. Obviously, you can add a panel to yours. I'm really happy with how this thing turned out, and it was actually really quick to do. I had to spread it out because of my schedule, but you could easily make this entire thing in a weekend. It's considerably cheaper than the full-size machine that I made because I'm using an old, cheap monitor. I got this for $10 on eBay, believe it or not. I'm using 1/2-inch plywood and not even a full sheet. Now people always ask in the comments of the other videos, where do I get the games for these? I'm not going to tell you that, and I've said it in the other videos. Just Google. You can find what you need. Google. If you want more information on setting up the electronics or any of that stuff, be sure to check out the older videos. I'll have those linked down in the description. It's a whole playlist of 4 videos that you can check out. But one of the things that is not covered there that always comes up in the comments is how do you set up player 2? It's pretty easy to do, but it's not very obvious. I'm going to put a link down in the description. Follow that if you want to figure out how to set up the second player on this. I hope you like this project, and I hope a lot of you will make this, and if you do, tag me in a photo on Instagram or on Twitter or something. I want to see it. I've got lots of other videos that you might be interested in. Be sure to check out the playlist for the full-size arcade if you haven't seen it. Don't forget to subscribe, and I have a second channel with some behind-the-scenes and non-project stuff. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.